So we've seen countless versions of both Rick and Morty throughout the series, with each and every one of them being just as crazy and unique as the last. But for someone like Jerry, these alternate versions are about as ridiculous as it gets. Like Jerry has versions akin to gods, evil geniuses who can rival Rick in intelligence, and even an AI simulated robot that Summer plans to make love to. Like the list and the crazy amount of Jerrys just goes on and on. And today we're going to go through and explain every single one of them. So without wasting any more of your time, let's begin with the first version of Jerry Smith. It's Jerry Prime. Now Jerry Prime was the original version of current Jerry, from the Prime Dimension, before it was overrun by the Cronenberg. After its Cronenberg infestation, Rick and Morty obviously left that dimension and began anew in Dimension C-131. But as we of course learned much later on, the Smith family, now excluding Rick and Morty, actually survived that invasion and subsequently even became stronger because of it.
Nobody's killing me until after I catch my wife with another man.
They had to fight every day just to survive, and by the time Morty arrived there much later, they had become more beast than human. But then after the Rick showed up and froze the three for quite some time, it was revealed that after being freed by some monster out in the world, Beth got sick by some disease and died, and Summer actually followed shortly after her. Jerry Prime then, however, survived, and while being left all alone in this world without anyone to speak to, he had actually become more content. He no longer sought revenge on Rick or even cared about tomorrow. He considered his current life perfect, going as far to say that Rick was right all along about everyone just needing to let go. Jerry Prime then, however, ran into Rick Prime, who he then tried to kill almost immediately. But unsurprisingly to all of us, Jerry failed, and subsequently was killed moments later, which of course marked the end of Jerry Prime. Now moving on, we have everyone's favorite Jerry. It's of course the evil Jerry, also known as Doofus Jerry. Doofus Jerry is of course Jerry Smith from Dimension J19 Zeta 7, and the same Jerry who proved himself to be better than even Rick more times than I can remember. He, unlike most of his counterparts, was cruel, sadistic, and most of all, just outright ruthless. He conquered his Earth and became the richest and most successful man in it. But with no sympathy or regard towards others, he was widely considered a power-hungry man who was unable to accept rejection, which was actually seen when he beat the shit out of our Jerry when he refused to trade lives with him. He doesn't seem to have a Beth of his own or to have fallen in love with her prior to meeting Beth, and this is largely believed to be the reason why he actually differs so much to many of the other Jerrys. But now after he arrived in the other Jerry's dimension, he quickly fell for and charmed both Beth and Summer, even commenting that Summer, just like her mother, is a very beautiful woman and that they should actually go swimsuit shopping together at some point. But even despite his charms, Morty wasn't convinced, and inevitably he and Rick would do everything they could to remove this Jerry from their dimension. But surprisingly, no matter what Rick tried, he failed, like every single time. Doofus Jerry was just too much for Rick to handle. However, later that day he was apprehended by a group of Ricks sent by the Council of Ricks, where after some time they actually allowed him to enter the genetic reconstructor, which he then used to turn the pheromones expelled from his body to now become poisonous to all other Ricks around. And he actually managed to kill several Ricks before actually taking a seat on the Council of Ricks and declaring himself as the master of all Ricks. But sometime later, however, the Smith family plus Doofus Rick flew to the Citadel in a giant robot, which they then used to fight Doofus Jerry's own giant robot. It was a short fight which Doofus Jerry of course won when his robot ripped the head off of Rick's robot, which he then subsequently threw down to the Citadel. Doofus Jerry then hurried over to the wreckage and offered Beth to be his queen, but she of course denied this request, which resulted in Doofus Jerry pulling a gun on both Beth and Summer. But right then the Jerry from before arrived to save the day. But as Doofus Jerry was about to kill the Smiths, the portal juice that Doofus Rick made so that he and Jerry could return to this dimension actually opened up a new portal which allowed a gigantic worm monster to come true and fall upon Doofus Jerry, apparently killing him. But in the world of Rick and Morty, who can really say for sure whether he's actually dead or not? So with that said, let's move on to Delta, which isn't technically a version of Jerry, but more of just an AI that is made with his personality and traits connected to it. You see, this was actually a Rick and Morty short story created by Takashi Sano, and the episode was actually called Summer Meets God, Rick Meets Evil. In it, Summer meets a mysterious AI named Delta. They quickly develop a bond with one another and they actually start dating. She of course at this point has no clue who he's actually based upon. And to her, he's just a very awkward and kind AI who also seems to really care about her and her family. However, despite being basically the brain of Jerry, he actually doesn't seem to remember ever being a human at all, as seen by the fact that he asked Summer multiple times in the episode if humans can actually dream. Now Delta does eventually manage to find Jerry and subsequently re-merge with him. But this, however, understandably leaves Summer totally disgusted, when she finally finds out the truth at the very end of the episode. So yeah, that's Delta. Moving on, we have Dougie from the 11-minute long episode that aired unannounced on Adult Swim on April 1st, 2018, titled Bushworld Adventures. Dougie is the recently divorced dad of Morty and friend of Reek. He appears in the Bush dimension where he attempts to cure Morty of a snake bite by putting a witchetty grub on his genitals. This actually just turned out to be a prank, and he actually then helps them reach Uncle Barry. Now, it is also worth noting, however, that Dougie, while being a version of Jerry, actually differs quite a bit from the usual cartoon version of him, as he is seen wearing the same dull expression throughout the entire episode. And also by the fact that he also appears to be a more laid back and just tame version of the main Jerry. Now, there's not really much else I can really say about him, so let's just move right ahead to the next Jerry on the list, which is the Evil Jerry clone, which was an alternate version of the original Jerry who appeared in the beginning of the episode Meek Seeks and Destroy, which of course aired in the first season. He was a clone from an alternate reality who was possessed by a demonic alien from another dimension's future. He was also the husband to the evil Beth clone and the dad to the evil Summer clone. He is considered exactly like the original in every way aside from the fact that he is possessed. And he was only in the show briefly, so there really isn't much to talk about when it comes to him. So with that said, I'm just going to move straight on to the female Jerry. Now, the female Jerry is again a female version of Jerry Smith from an unknown dimension. She was of course seen only once in issue 23 of the comics, when Jerry and Doofus Rick were running through some rainbow world. She has long hair and long eyelashes, but aside from that, she's really just an ugly female version of our Jerry. So with that said, let's move on to Glockenspiel Jerry, who is the major character in the episode Morty Publicity, which of course was episode 2 of season 5. He is one of the many Jerry Smith decoys seen in that episode, with the only real difference with him to the regular Jerry being that he is made completely of wood. Now, he is also one of the Jerrys who suffers more than any other, as in his quest for Varnish, he kills his family, gets eaten and destroyed by birds, sold and hung by cowboys, and then stuck to a cross beside what can only be called Future Jesus. Now, little is known about what actually follows after this, but it is widely believed that to this day, he still hangs upon that cross. Moving on, next we have the Ideal Jerry, which is of course one of the mythologs of Jerry Smith, who appeared in the episode Big Trouble in Little Sanchez. He is basically the way Beth has come to view Jerry when he is currently fighting off the other Jerry mythologs. He is a taller, selfless, and more muscular version of Beth's own Jerry. He is by every definition the ideal Jerry. Nothing more, nothing less. Now next we have JERRICKY. JERRICKY is a fusion of Rick Sanchez and Jerry Smith, who came into existence when their minds ended up getting mixed together in the episode The JERRICK Trap. JERRICKY actually came about later in that same episode when Rick Jerry and Jerry Rick came together to create the ultimate JERRICKY. Now Rick Jerry and Jerry Rick will be mentioned later in the videos, so we'll come back to them in just a second. They came together in order to save the rest of the Smith family from Chuxley, who was actually going to kill them if they didn't show up. Now JERRICKY to them was considered the most perfect version of both of them, but to me it was just some sort of monstrosity that I really don't want to see ever again. But now with that said, let's move on to the Jerry clone head from season 4 episode 5 titled Rattlestar Ricklactica. In this episode we see Jerry attempting to lie to Beth after he accidentally lost his shoes that Rick made gravitational. Rick pieces all of this together and then freezes Beth with a remote. He tells Jerry that he's actually going to help him out since it's Christmas, but Jerry actually refuses and hangs up the phone. But right then, Rick turns on a machine in the lab and creates a DNA sample of a horribly disfigured fungus version of Jerry's head, and then uses that sample to get Beth to believe Jerry is actually okay. After this is done, the head is then sprayed with acid and killed, marking the end of Jerry's clone head. Up next we have Jerry 304-X, who is seen in Rick and Morty issue 9. This Jerry is extremely dumb and clumsy, and honestly a dumber and clumsier version than even the regular Jerry. He is stupid and barely able to even follow the simplest of orders. Therefore, they had to just place him as a doorman to their base because there was nothing else that he could actually do. Now, even though he was completely hated by everyone else around, he actually didn't seem to be affected by it at all, which I guess is just another privilege of being incredibly dumb. Now, his clumsiness and stupidity, however, is extremely high, to the point that in the end he accidentally even shoots Morty C-132. Before he actually continues to blow the rest of his family up in an explosion that even kills himself. So yeah, 304X, just a more stupid version of our Jerry, if that's even possible. Next up, we have Jerry C-131, also known as Season 2's Jerry. He's another extremely basic version of Jerry, so I'll explain what happened with him as quickly as I can. Now, while waiting for his family to return, he found Mr. Fundles, a parasitic creature referred to by Jerry C-131 as a boogan. Now, while undeniably cute, Mr. Fungus is actually incredibly deadly, as once they are exposed to the open environment, they will affect all things both living and inanimate, turning them into another version of Mr. Fundles, which is of course what happened to Jerry C-131 and the entire world. Moving on, next we have Jerry C-132, which is actually a Jerry we briefly mentioned earlier when we spoke about Doofus Jerry. For you see, the Jerry in that story is Jerry C-132. That's right, this average as fuck Jerry aided greatly in the defeat of Doofus Jerry himself, which is actually kind of insane to even think about. Now, Jerry C-132 is much like his cartoon counterpart in almost every way, except that this Jerry is completely cowardly, and someone who is actually often depicted as incredibly selfish and arrogant, often even betraying his own wife and children multiple times throughout the comics. He did, however, slightly redeem himself with his quest to return to his family and aid them against evil Doofus Jerry. Though I do also argue that the only reason they were in danger by Doofus Jerry is because of him in the first place. So is he really redeemed? You tell me. Up next we have Jerry C-290, who is a Jerry with a really shit haircut. He's also a Jerry who is only ever seen once in the evil Morty's flashback scene from Season 7 Episode 5 titled On Mort'Ricken. Now, as he's only seen here and never again throughout the entire show, I'm just going to skip right ahead and just let you know that Jerry C-290 is just a Jerry with a shit haircut. Now next we have Jerry C-500A, who is basically a version of Jerry that never got married or had any kids with Beth. He's actually a Jerry who went on to become very successful in acting. This was, however, until later in life when he suffered an extreme nervous breakdown, which of course led him to his new life with Beth. Now, Jerry C-500A's personality is basically the same as the original Jerry, only like I just said, this Jerry is actually in an environment that respects and loves him, which of course has completely taken away the loser side of his personality and actually replaced it with quite the opposite. Jerry C-500A is basically a Jerry that people actually like. I know, crazy right? I didn't think that was even going to be possible in the entire multiverse. Now up next we have Jerry D-324, which is a Jerry with noticeably wide hips, making him appear almost pear-shaped, which of course is how he earned his nickname, Pear-Shaped Jerry. He was killed by Jerry Smith in a revolt at the Jerry Brewery, which is actually where we see multiple other versions of Jerry who at this point are unnamed. So this will be of course the only mention of them in this video. Now, Pear-Shaped Jerry apparently came from another version of Earth that has a very bad climate problem, which Jerry actually states is a reason for his incredibly wide hips. But it's also just widely believed that he has incredibly wide hips because he's, well, fat. Moving on, we have just another plain old Jerry Smith from Season 1, Episode 10, titled Close Rick Encounters of the Rick Kind. In this episode, Jerry is seen sitting at a table eating breakfast with the rest of his family, until a sudden attack from Evil Rick and Evil Morty, who just appear in the room and shoot his father-in-law Rick before taking his son Morty hostage, leaving this plain old Jerry Smith screaming in terror. Now, he's never really seen ever again throughout the entire show, so let's just move right along to the next Jerry on the list, which is Jerry Smith from the Parmesan dimension, which is of course a Jerry that is dead. Now you see, he, along with the rest of the Smith family, managed to save their dimension from Mr. Fundles before dying from natural causes. The titular Smith family buried their bodies in the backyard, then continued to live their lives in that dimension as if nothing had happened. Now at this point, I'm beginning to see why a lot of people consider Jerry absolutely worthless, because as you can see, most of his counterparts are just absolutely worthless. But now with that said, moving on, we have Jerry's MYTHOLOG, which just like the ideal version of Jerry that we mentioned earlier, is a physical representation of the way Beth perceives Jerry, at least in the beginning of that episode. This MYTHOLOG went rogue and teamed up with Beth's MYTHOLOG, which then together combined their efforts to now try and take over the world. Now, being based on Beth's personal perception of Jerry, this MYTHOLOG is a comically exaggerated parody of the real Jerry, being that it is a spineless, very short, fat, worm-like creature with Jerry's face and hair, as well as being a very cowardly individual who just submits before anyone or anything even vaguely threatening happens around it. But now it does follow Beth's MYTHOLOG first and foremost, which I guess just highlights the loyalty that he has for her, which I guess is some kind of plus if you really look at it that way. But now moving on, up next we have Jerry Rick and Rick Jerry, formerly known as Burger and Fries. They are the main characters in the episode The JERRICKY Trap. They're basically a mixture of Rick Sanchez and Jerry Smith's minds in the bodies of Rick and Jerry, which also means they aren't as smart or as dumb as they used to be. They're now just slightly above average in almost every way. But now in the beginning of the episode, they actually hate each other, but as the episode develops, they actually learn to work well together in order to save Morty. And like I mentioned earlier, by the end of the episode, they actually come together to create what is known as JERRICKY, But of course, we spoke on that earlier in this video, so if you want to learn more about that, just go back and rewatch that section. For now, just know that Jerry Rick and Rick Jerry are actually two of the most fun versions of Rick and Jerry, at least in my opinion. Moving on, we have Night Jerry, from the 4th episode of the 6th season. Now, Night Jerry and the Night Smiths are the unconscious personas of the Smith family. They are brought to sentience when Rick used one of his machines on the rest of his family to awake their sleeping bodies to perform chores for them, essentially making use of their time asleep, which I can't lie, sounds incredibly amazing. But as you might expect, eventually the Night family go off the rails and begin plans to take over even the Day, with only Night Jerry actually deciding to aid the Day family. But inevitably, even this proved pointless, as by the end of the episode, the Night family actually won. And now, at least in that dimension, the Night family are the real family. Moving on, we have President Jerry, from issue 28 of the comics. Now, President Jerry is an alternate version of Jerry Smith from an unknown dimension, where in it he's of course the President of the United States. Now, he only appears in this one image and little is actually known about him as of right now, but here he is, so he has to be mentioned. Next, we have the self-gratulating Jerry, which also appears in the same episode as the MYTHOLOG Jerrys. They're basically MYTHOLOG versions of Jerry Smith, who just stand around and shake each other's hands, complimenting each other on everything they have done. They're potentially the most worthless versions of Jerry that actually exists out in the world, but they do exist, so they have to be mentioned, just like the previous Jerry. Next up, we have WASP Jerry, who is a version of Jerry from the WASP universe. Now, this is yet another fairly pointless Jerry seen in episode 1 of season 4. And aside from this Jerry just basically looking like a wasp, he really hasn't got anything else to mention. So I'm going to leave this explanation as it is and just move to the final group of Jerrys, the Abandoned Jerrys. These Jerrys are a group of Jerrys who reside in the Jerrybury, just waiting around to be picked up by Rick and Morty. Now, in the same episode, it's actually seen in the back rooms that there's actually some Jerrys that never get collected. So they just remain there waiting for all eternity. It's kinda sad until you remember just how AIDS a Jerry can be, and then you remember that this place may actually be heaven for the Rick and Mortys. Because obviously they no longer have to deal with Jerry, they can just put him in daycare. And realistically, if we're being honest, for the most part, the Jerrys seem content here. Sure, they'd rather be with their families back home, but I'd argue they're not totally sad with the place they currently are. But now up next, we have the last Jerry on the list. It's God Jerry, or Jerry X198. This Jerry is one of several Jerrys we see in the Jerrybury comic. In this comic, Rick tells them that they're going to go to the most fun place in the entire multiverse, and notes that he fully expects most of them will die there. But of course, if that happens, he will just clone them and forget the originals ever existed. When at Blitz and Chits, we actually see Jerry play with many games, and not all of them are actually what they appear to be. Some just end up trapping Jerry inside, and some others just end up beating him up. But he later learns that he can actually use the tokens he gains from the games to then collect what is known as a God Pill. This pill would make anyone who takes it into a god for 90 seconds. But it of course costs 10 billion tokens, which is a hell of a lot of tokens. Jerry then later gets told that today marks the day of his death, which angers him. So he then spends the rest of the day playing conflict resolution until he earns the 10 billion tokens he needs to earn the pill. After taking the pill and becoming God, he realizes that all Jerrys are there to do is suffer endless pain and punishment, which absolutely sickens him to the point that he decides to execute every last Jerry around. But just like Rick said in the beginning, he just cloned them all and went on like nothing ever happened. Which of course also means that everything that Jerry did when he was a god meant nothing. But now with that, we've finally reached the end of today's video. If you've enjoyed and would like to see another video like this one where we talk about Rick or Morty's alternate versions, tell me down below in the comments. And if you would, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel as it would really help us out a lot. And I'd very much appreciate it. But for now, that's going to do it for me and this video. I hope you all have a great day or night wherever you are, and peace.